Hey everyone, welcome back to Thought Bubble. I'm here today with the wonderful Jeff Lemire. Jeff, thank you for taking the time to come and chat with me. How are you finding the convention so far?
Oh, it's awesome. This is, I think, my fourth Thought Bubble. I think it's my fourth time, but the first time in Harrogate, so it's a bit different, but it's been great. Yeah, it's always kind of my favorite show. Yeah.
That seems to be like the running sentiment by a lot of people. I spoke to Al earlier and he said that like of all the conventions he goes to, this feels like the most, I don't know what the word is, like the most direct with fans and other creators and just the most kind of easily accessible way to network and meet people.
Yeah. It's also the most focused on comics, it's not about films or video games, and it's just really about a love of our medium.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. So speaking of comics, you have written a couple of comics in your time.
2 or 3,
Yeah, you're known to pen a comic here and there. I'm really interested, before we get into some specific books, I always like to ask people this when I interview them, what your first comic was, if you remember, like the very first issue you ever read. Do you know?
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I actually do. When I must have been, I think came out in 1982, so I would have been
We don't have to age you too much.
6 years old. And it was, I don't know about in the UK, but in the US and Canada, DC Comics would reprint a lot of their old 60s and 70s stuff as these little digest-size comics, and they'd be available like in grocery stores and things. And I remember my mom buying me, it was a reprint of all the Justice Society of America stuff from DC Comics.
Like the Golden Age.
The Golden Age stuff, yeah, and then one of the the 70s stories that Paul Levitz had done, and that was my first comic. I still have it, yeah.
Oh, nice! You still have it?
Yeah, I found it actually last week. I looked for it and found it.
Oh, that's really cool. So with that, going from kind of humble beginnings to now, you recently launched Phantom Road with Gabriel Walter. When I heard the pitch for it, I immediately knew that was a book that I was going to vibe with. Like I saw the press release described it as Mad Max meets the Sandman. And like, there's definitely like a big Preacher vibe in there as well. I'm really curious in asking, obviously you've done a couple of create-your-own works now and knowing kind of what the process is different, making something yourself like you and Gabriel. But then also like where the idea for this specific story in this world came from.
I actually don't remember. Sometimes I do. This one, I don't. It wasn't even an idea for a story. It was more a type of book, like a feeling that I wanted to do. And I think I was looking for a hook into it. I wanted to do something that felt like the Vertigo comics I loved as a teenager. So Hellblazer and Preacher and Sandman. Yeah. So I right from the start, there was a certain vibe I wanted, and I also wanted it to be a long series. Like I wanted to commit to doing like a 50 or 60 issue, big, like a real Vertigo comic. They used to do them, you know. So I had this. It was more that kind of thing. I knew I wanted to do something with the FBI and sort of an investigative angle, and something with
crime,
something with like other worlds and sort of the crossing the line between reality and a liminal world. And then this is so down. I was watching Terminator 2 Judgment Day one night, and there's that scene where the Robert Patrick bad Terminator is driving the big truck after Arnold's, and I was like, this should be a truck driver.
That is like, but that's like one of
it's
the
great dumbest
things,
scenes. But like the simplest things can spark some idea in your head.
It's funny. So it's funny you mentioned T2 because like when I was from what I've read and what I've seen, like it gives me a vibe of like The Fugitive.
Okay.
Which is it's interesting, like because I'd say it's a fairly cinematic comic. It's not a term I love using, but like you could see how it could be translated. Was that an intentional thing to kind of pull from cinematic influences, or is that just kind of absorbing what's around you?
Yeah, no, it was all comics for me. I mean, Gabriel may have his own influences on the visuals, obviously, but for me it was more vibing with those early Vertigo books, really. I wasn't thinking about film or TV at all. I mean, The X-Files was certainly, and Twin Peaks are a big influence on it, but not visually so much or in the storytelling, just more in like the themes and the story.
That's really interesting to hear. And so obviously one of your most kind of successful creator work, Sweet Tooth, got adapted a couple of years ago. The third season is due in the next year or so, from what I believe. I know they're working on it. It's really interesting. So I was just so curious in asking how involved you were in the kind of development of the show, and if so, kind of like how you found the process different, not only writing and working for television, but also kind of like going back to something you'd written years ago and kind of like with a current mindset reevaluating it.
Well, to be honest, I've had 2 adaptations in the past couple of years, Sweet Tooth and then my Essex County graphic novel, and my experiences on both were complete opposites. So Sweet Tooth, I was not involved in any way creatively with that show. I got to visit the set, but just more of as an observer and to enjoy kind of being part of the process. But I wasn't. I had no input on
like formal consultancy.
Yeah, I didn't do any writing, nothing like that. So that one, it was really more just me as an observer. I had just because of my contract with Vertigo and things, I didn't have any control. So I just had to let it go. But Essex County was the exact opposite, where I controlled every aspect of the adaptation. I wrote every episode. I was the showrunner. I was across every decision, So that was, I could speak more to that in terms of process, and that was really interesting to go back to my first book now, it's almost 20 years later, and re-examine those characters in that world from a completely different point of view, So, it made me appreciate the simplicity of my life when I did that first book, because it was just, I wasn't a parent yet, and it was just I could focus on comics, and there was no stakes because I wasn't even published yet, so I was just doing it for myself. And that there's a joy to that.
Absolutely.
That you can lose once you start making it a career. So it's good to remember that joy and try to hold on to that, I guess.
I think that's a really poignant thing to say. I remember reading into with Robert Kirkman talking about, because he does a lot of the writing for the Invincible show. And obviously, that's a book that he started writing 15, 20 years ago. And obviously, he's had such a big career, both at that time and since then. He talks about how kind of coming back to that world and those characters and telling those stories again, he finds how much stuff he's changing now, just because of his tastes, his preferences, and his lived experiences are kind of changing how he contextualizes these stories. And I think it's interesting how, these stories we tell aren't static. As we change, if we go back to them, they change as well. Do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, well, I mean, just a specific example of that in the Essex County show is, when I did the book, I wasn't a father yet, so when I was writing the character of Lester, the little boy, it was really me writing about myself and my childhood. But now I have a son who's like Lester's age, and I'm a father, and I actually found myself relating more to the uncle in the book, his father figure, and developing that character more, and then almost approaching Lester as from the opposite point of view as a parent, so that it's interesting. I'm a different person than I was, and I couldn't recreate it exactly, So.
Yeah, that's true. I think you can only write in the present who you are now, and it's interesting to see how a character that was kind of very much paralleling your experiences 15, 20 years ago, now you resonate with other characters in the same story. I think that's really cool. So thinking about kind of stuff at Marvel, you've done a lot. Moon Knight is a big one. I know the people that watch my stuff are a huge fan of the Moon Knight run. I love it. And I think what I really enjoyed about it, obviously, there's been a lot of good Moon Knight comics over the last 15 years. There's the Warren Ellis run that kind of came before yours that was really celebrated. And then your one as well. We got back-to-back Moon Knight bangers, essentially. What I thought was really interesting about your run was how I found it really introspective. And it really, fleshed out a lot of the backstory and the history of Mark. And, really kind of dived into a lot of the DID stuff in a way that I found surprisingly tasteful for mainstream comics. There's a long history of characters who have dissociative identity disorder, going back to the Hulk, Crazy Jane, and Doom Patrol. It's a thing that's been talked about before, but from my knowledge of it and from hearing and reading people with the condition that have read your work, they found it to be a very tasteful and, despite the fact that obviously Moon Knight is a superhero that fights bad guys, a fairly tasteful and faithful recreation of what that condition can be like. Just been curious in asking, when you were writing that series, what inspired you, and also what kind of research you conducted into not only the kind of mythological side of Moon Knight, but also into kind of his disability as well.
It's nice to hear that that's the sentiment. I tried to treat it with respect, obviously. It is a Marvel comic and a superhero comic, but that stuff, if you do it right, the superhero stuff just becomes a metaphor for...
With that, Marvel's always been the world outside your window.
What's that? Yes, there's true.
There's always a centre of realism to the story.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So, I started, just to answer the question as best I can, I started by researching the character and his history. So, one thing I really wanted to do was take all the different runs and the different sort of incarnations of Moon Knight from the original Doug Mensch and Bill Sienkiewicz stuff forward, and kind of have my run celebrate all those different eras and make them part of the present. So that's how I started, and then it just when I was doing that, it sounds very simple, but it was like, oh, wait a minute, like these different eras and when different creators take on a character, they bring their own personalities to it. So it's like, wait a minute, like the different sort of feeling and personality that brought to each era can easily reflect Mark's mindset and his illness. And that's just the simple little seed of how I built everything else. And then in terms of the research into the disease and stuff, unless you have it, you can't fully understand it.
You can only know so
much.
Much.
So what I just tried to treat Mark like a human being with respect, and treat the illness with respect, that not thinking of it, oh, this guy's crazy and there's something wrong with him, but no, this guy's different and there's something different about him, and that can be celebrated and embraced, and it becomes part of who he is.
I definitely remember reading it at the time it was coming out and finding it a lot, not that I expected it to be anything less, but almost being like pleasantly surprised by how like human Mark feels in the story, and how like his disability isn't treated as this kind of like horrible thing that torments him. There are positives to it and there are negatives to it, and that's how people with those conditions. Yeah, exactly. So kind of switching gears a little bit, a book of yours I'm reading currently for the first time is Frankenstein, Agents of Shade.
Oh, cool.
And so I've been researching into the Creature Commandos recently, because obviously they've got the show coming out next year, and I'm a lover of kind of like old weird J and D Mateus comics. Like his Weird Ward tales are awesome, but I'd never actually gone and read any of the original Creature Commandos run. And then like James Gunn seems to be a guy that has fairly similar sensibilities to me. Like we seem to like a lot of the same comics. So if he thinks it's something worth adapting, I was like, okay, I'll go and I'll check the original D Mateus run out. So I read all those original stories, thought they were really fun, and then I was like, right, let's see what modern writers have done with it. And I stumbled upon your Agents of Shade run. I thought it was really, really cool. I love the kind of, it's like one part like Howling Commandos, one part like classic Universal Monster. It's a really, really cool book, and in light of kind of what's coming in kind of adaptation in the show, I can certainly see how you can kind of like combine elements of the original J.M.D. Mateus Weird War comics, and also kind of some of the updated, the Shade stuff that you've added in. It's really curious just asking about your experience working on that title, what it was like working with these kind of like classic monster characters compared to like more traditional superhero stuff, and just overall kind of what your thoughts on that series was.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because I did a number of books at DC when the New 52 thing was launching, and Animal Man and Green Arrow are the ones people remember, but I feel like Frankenstein's like a hidden gem a little bit.
That's how I felt. Like obviously I
had a lot of fun.
I read Animal Man. I'm a huge fan of the Morrison role.
Yeah.
So I'm always like, there's another Animal Man series I read it, and obviously that's a tremendous series.
Yes.
And Frankenstein kind of like, because it's such a weird book.
Yeah, I mean, to give credit where it's due, I think I was really just riffing off things I love. So there's the original De Mateus stuff, which is incredible, and then there's the Grant Morrison Frankenstein from Seven Soldiers, and he created Shade. He created that version of Frankenstein, and I absolutely fucking love that book. That Doug Mankey and the Grant Morrison Frankenstein. I just loved it book. And that was before I was working in comics. As a fan, just loved it. So when I had the chance to like take what Grant Morrison had done and then take what the original Creature Commandos and like mash them into something, it was just, honestly, it was just fun, and it was almost like fan fiction. It was just, I had a blast doing it. It was my homage to both these creators who I adore, Grant Morrison and JM. So yeah.
So just like they're two of my all-time favorite writers. So like just the thought of getting to play in the sandbox of like their genius must be so fun and so exciting.
Yeah, and then you try to add your own personality and some new things to it as well, so that you've added, and you're not just repeating, but you're adding as well.
It's like taking it and passing it on to the next. Yeah, that's really interesting. Another book of yours that I've always kind of been quite curious with was Teen Titans Earth 1.
Okay.
Big Teen Titans guy here. I grew up watching the cartoons in the early 2000s. And I remember when the Earth 1 books started coming out. They're quite a curious series overall, aren't they?
Yeah.
Kind of like the original graphic novel format and how radical some of the reinventions were. I spoke to, last year I covered the Green Lantern series.
Okay.
That Hardman and Becker did on the channel.
Yeah.
It's fantastic.
It looked cool. I should check that out.
And I spoke to Gabriel Hardman, the co-writer and artist of it, and here, because it's like this dystopian, post-apocalyptic future, almost like John Carter of Mars, Green Lantern. It's really interesting.
That's cool.
And it's so like unlike anything you've ever seen Hal do before. And the Teen Titans book as well is a very like different take on those characters from anything you've seen previously. I remember when I read the first volume and thinking like, this feels more like Runaways than it feels like Teen Titans. Which is a compliment. Runaways is a fantastic series, but it had more of that kind of like youthful coming of age, inexperienced. Like, Teen Titans are all sidekicks traditionally.
Yeah.
They're all like capable, experienced superheroes.
Yeah.
Whereas your version of the team very much felt like a group of kids in this like strange and unexpected situation where all these accidents are happening to them, kind of figuring it out as they go along.
Right.
Obviously, like with the long history of the Titans going back to like the 60s and 70s, when you're given this series to basically like do whatever you want with it, if that was what you were given, how do you go about crafting a unique take on that team?
It was actually quite a challenge because I was the comic that really got me to fall in love with comics was the New Teen Titans of George Perez and Marv Wolfman. I was like 10, 11 years old when that was coming out, and it was incredible. So I have a huge love for those characters. But the trick was, I mean, you said it, the Teen Titans started off as sidekicks to adult characters, so Robin and Wonder Girl and Aqualad and whatever. But the problem I had was in this Earth 1 universe, those characters didn't exist yet, or if some of them did exist, like Batman existed, but they weren't at the stage yet where they would have a Robin. So I had to create.
And even if a Robin was introduced, like, would that be something that could be crossed
Yeah,
over?
and
none of those books ever.
They didn't really cross over. I didn't even know if they were in continuity. We were never told, right? So the challenge was, okay, how do I create a version of these characters but are not derivative of adult characters? So that's the first challenge as a writer, and it stemmed out from that. That was of me trying to figure out how these characters could exist free from Batman and Wonder Woman, and then building a story out of that. Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting. So with that, like, it's a very different take on Deathstroke as well.
Yeah.
Was there any kind of thing that you pulled from for that characterization at all?
I'll have to admit, some of these things I don't remember as well as I wish. I was writing so much stuff so I barely remember what my Deathstroke character is. But I think I was trying to play off.
He's in like an exosuit, and he's like one of the dads.
Yeah, he was one of the dads. So I think I was trying to build a thing with him and Jericho being like a father-son relationship, and so I think it just sort of stemmed out of that core emotional relationship between those two characters. I can't remember anything else. It's a long time ago.
It's a book that came out quite a while ago, and it is one that I think fell under the radar a little bit. I think it's something that will probably end up being reappreciated.
I hope so, yeah.
Where people go back and go, well, actually, this was really, really fun. And with that, obviously, like, it felt like with the Earth 1 books, they came out as like this big storm. Like Straczynski was doing Superman, Johns was doing Batman, Grant was doing Wonder Woman. And then they kind of like, I think just because of like, one, the original graphic novel format, and two, like, you had the New 52, and then you had Rebirth. It was like quite a turbulent time.
Yeah, there was a lot of stuff going on.
Editorially and continuity. Yeah. So it felt like those books kind of like fell by the wayside a little bit.
A little bit. By the time Teen Titans and the Green Lantern one, I think the wave had already passed, so we kind of didn't get as much publicity, and I think people were already sort of over whatever that initial. Yes, exactly. So they kind of fell under the radar, and then it didn't help that Volume 1 and Volume 2 of the Titans had different artists as well, so it felt like there wasn't quite. Then I love both artists. Andy McDonald and Terry Dodson are incredible, but I think it would have helped if there was a continuity of the world, and yeah.
That makes sense, and like, so I was trying to remember what I was going to say. Yeah, like I said, it came. I remember with the Green Lantern series when I covered it on the channel last year. There were so many people who watched the video that had never read the book.
Right.
And didn't even know that there was a Green Lantern series. And it's such a shame because it is genuinely a really, really terrific, like almost sci-fi horror comic that just happens to have rings and guys floating through space. And I think Titans is the same. Like, I think if it had come out maybe like even 3 years earlier, I think it would have got a lot more eyes on it, which is a shame, but it is something that happens.
Sometimes that's the best stuff, though, is the stuff you flew under the radar, and then like 10, 15 years later, you discover some hidden run that isn't really celebrated, but it's amazing.
Yeah.
I love finding that.
And so with that, obviously, like, it felt like in the last like 5 years or so, like, there'd been a couple of attempts to finish off those unfinished Earth 1 books.
Oh, really?
Like, Grant did the third volume of Wonder Woman. Johns did the third volume of Batman after like a 6-year gap between volume 2. And when I spoke to Gabriel Hardman, he kind of explained some of the behind-the-scenes reasons as to why Green Lantern only got 2 volumes
Was there any other conversations about doing a third volume for Titans?
I think initially there was, like, because I think they were all planned to be 3. But I think a couple of things worked against us. We lost our original artist, Terry Dotson, and then I think, like you said, the sales bubble had kind of passed by the time the second volume of Titans came out, and it just wasn't feasible. And then things shifted editorially at DC, where the Earth-1 books just stopped being a priority. But I think, like with Jeff and Grant, they have, if they want to do a third volume, they can call their shots, and I never really pushed for it. So yeah,
it makes sense. I feel like with like Johns and Morris and their writers, that like if they go to a DC editor and say, "I'm doing this book," exactly. Who's going to turn them down?
Yeah.
So it's like they came and finished off that, and I think it's a shame because I thought that, like, especially in volume 2, like the story in the world really gets going.
Yeah, I had a plan for the third one of the alien invasion, and I remember that. I don't remember more than that now. I'm sure I have it written down somewhere, but I know that the Tamaran was coming to get Starfire. That was like the thing, and we were gonna have a Nightwing and stuff. But yeah, I think I'm sure if I had pushed, maybe I could have.
It was just like you were moving into it.
Yeah, I had moved on, and I think I was we're super busy. I think I can't remember the timing, but I think there might have been something like another factor could have been that I went from DC to Marvel around that time. So maybe there was, it's like, well, forget that,
Yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's a shame because I do think it's a really fun series, and it's something that I'm looking to cover on my channel next year and kind of give it a bit of a reappraisal maybe, because I think there's some.
After this, if you email me, I'll see if I have a file or something with it. I don't know if I have anything written down for 3. I have no idea.
So finally, I've got just a couple of quick questions I wanted to ask before we wrap this up. Yeah. Firstly, this one might not be something you can talk too much about, but you've written a lot of characters, Marvel, DC, you've done a lot of create your own stuff. Is the one character that you've never got the opportunity to do any sort of story with that you'd like to? Or any character that maybe that's like been in a team book or like crossed over that you've wanted to kind of have a proper run with?
Yeah, for sure. I love, especially DC is what I grew up reading mostly. I wasn't a Marvel kid, so those are the characters that I kind of, they're deeply part of my DNA, and so there's always an itch to scratch with a lot of those characters. I'd really wanted to do a proper Swamp Thing book, and I got to do that with Doug Mankey last year. So that was a nice one. I've always loved the Golden Age DC characters, JSA being my first book, so I would really love to do something with the Golden Age DC characters at some point.
It seems like there is a little bit of a kind of reappraisal of the JSA over the last 10 years or so. Obviously, like when the New 52 happened, you got the Earth 2 book, which was like it was almost like an Ultimate Universe JSA.
Exactly.
But I thought that was a fun book. And then very recently, you've got the Alan Scott book that Tim Sheridan's doing. Yeah. Tim's a friend of the channel, and I read the first issue recently, and it's really, really good.
Yeah, it's good.
And it's interesting to see like this like titan of the golden age of comics getting brought back and reevaluated, especially with like some of the things that continuity has added to Alan about his sexuality, and obviously Tim writing it as well as a queer writer. I think it's a really interesting way of like recontextualizing almost like this bygone generation of heroes in a very modern way.
Yeah, exactly.
Are there any particular Golden Age characters that you'd like to sink your teeth into?
Well, I mean, my favorites for some weird reason were always Hourman, Dr. Midnight, and Dr. Fate.
Hourman was one of the ones I was thinking.
Hourman, so I love those 3. I have a weird thing for those 3 characters. But honestly, I love all those. Jake Eric's an incredible character, and Hawkman's great. I love them all. So yeah, I don't know. So hopefully one day I get a chance to do something with them. It'll be good.
And so final question, I was just curious in asking, what was, like when you were starting out in comics, when you were kind of breaking into the industry, what was the best piece of advice anyone ever gave you? And then following on from that, what would be a piece of advice you would give to someone watching this that is looking to kind of break into the industry a little bit?
Yeah. So early on, when I was trying to make my own comics, I didn't really have a community around me of other comic book creators, so I was very much in a vacuum. And when you're doing that, you can have days where you start to doubt what you're doing has any value, And this was the early days of the internet, because I'm a bit older, but I reached out to a couple professional creators who I admired. I found their emails online and stuff, and one of them was John Toddleben, who did a lot of the Swamp Thing stuff with Alamore. And I sent him some early comics and just asked if he had any advice, And he just told me, it sounds very simple, but he said, if you enjoy what you're doing and you're passionate about what you're doing, it will come through. There's chances are someone else will enjoy it as well. So don't worry about what other people are doing. Don't worry about what's popular at the moment. Just do the thing that you really love, and someone else will love it. It'll come through. And so I just stuck to doing that, and it really worked for me. And I mean, it's good advice to pass on, but I think the other big stumbling block for anyone trying to get into any creative sort of endeavor, especially writing, is just getting started, because there's so many reasons to not do it. And so many, well, I just need to do this before I can do it. I just need to get this done before I start this. And those are, you just have to push through, and you have to finish something. Like, even if it's not great, just finish something and then make your next one better, and then make the next one better.
A bad piece of work that's finished is better than an unfinished.
100% it is. Yeah, nothing is ever going to be perfect. You'd be like, well, this story's not good enough. I have to wait until I have something better to publish. Just put it out.
But if you always wait, you're never going to produce anything.
Nothing will ever be perfect. You just make the next one a little better. Yeah.
Absolutely. So yeah, I want to thank you for taking this time to chat with us. Do you want to kind of promote or plug anything on your way out? Obviously, Phantom Road is out. That is definitely a book I want to recommend to people. Anything else that's either out currently or in the pipeline that you want to kind of shout out?
Yeah, I mean, Phantom Road's a big one. It's we really have a lot of ambitious plans for that, and I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, originally thought it was just a mini-series, but they're realizing now it's a big ongoing book. So please support it, because it needs it. And then I have a new book that I'm writing and drawing for Image called Fish Flies that I'm really proud of. So that's coming out every other month as 60-issue, big, thick issues. So those are the two kind of main books right now.
Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed watching this. And yeah, I will see you next time. Take care.